The dinner bell never stopped ringing. It began as a faint metallic pulse from the dining hall, echoing down the long corridor of the Ravenscroft Plantation house. By the time the neighbors arrived the next morning, the bell was still swaying, its clang soft, irregular, as if someone invisible kept brushing against it. 8 family members sat perfectly still around the dining table, their hands folded, eyes open, and mouths frozen in the faintest smiles. The roast turkey on the platter had turned a shade of gray, steam long gone. Candle wax had spilled like melted bone. The air smelled of vinegar and iron. In the corner stood Etta, the house slave, small, silent, her apron stained with something that wasn't wine. She did not speak when they found her. She only watched the bell continue to sway above their heads. They said she was mad. They said she had been whispering hymns no one had taught her, words that sounded older than English. But the ledger recovered years later, now locked away in the Charleston Historical Society, suggests something else. Inside, in a woman's delicate hand, is written only one line under the date November 26, 1857. The Lord refused their blessings. I only opened the door. No one ever explained what that meant. The county records from that winter mention an incident of mass illness. The local parish notes an unholy Thanksgiving. Yet beneath the parish floorboards when renovations began in 1903, a second bell was found, smaller, blackened, tied with hair. Every year since, the locals say the Ravenscroft house rings its bell on Thanksgiving night. Not loud enough for the living, but enough for the hungry. And if you stand outside the gate, some swear you can still smell vinegar and iron. The ledger was discovered in 1903 by a carpenter named Amos Griggs during the restoration of the old Ravenscroft estate. It was wedged behind the wall of the east parlor, wrapped in oilcloth, its pages swollen from decades of damp air. The first few leaves were blank, except for a faint watermark of a bell, hand-pressed into the paper, a symbol no one recognized. Inside, the handwriting shifted, sometimes cursive, sometimes blocky, sometimes trembling, as if written by different people. But the name Etta appeared over and over, often crossed out, rewritten, or replaced with Ettaline, as though the writer couldn't decide which name belonged to her. The entries began years before the dinner, back when Etta was a child purchased from Charleston in 1843. Each note recorded small details of her service. Excellent seamstress, quiet, does not sleep, speaks in her cradle tongue to the walls, and then in the autumn of 1857 the tone changed. Whole passages were written in ink so dark it bled through the paper. The girl hums the same song that my grandmother warned me never to sing, the one that bends the light in the room. She looks at the silver and it blackens. If she serves the table this year, we are all damned. After that, the ledger stops, save for one final entry, dated November 27th, 1857. They did not die. They were called. Historians dismissed it as a delusion, Southern hysteria, they said, the last gasp of a decaying class. But what troubled Griggs most wasn't the handwriting, it was the ink. Laboratory analysis decades later revealed it wasn't ink at all. It was iron gall mixed with blood. Whose blood? No one could say. What they did agree on, however, was that the handwriting on the final page didn't match any of the others. It was smaller, slanted, childlike, and in the margin faintly, as if pressed by a fingertip. The bell tolls for those who eat. Before the dinner, before the ledger, there was a song. It was heard first in the fields, soft, almost tender, carried by the wind that rose from the Combahee River. The others said Etta never learned it from anyone on the plantation. She began humming it one night when lightning struck a cypress tree behind the slave quarters. The air smelled of rain and copper, and she sat beneath the burned trunk singing. to the smoke as if answering something that had called her name. No one remembered the words exactly. Those who did refused to repeat them, but fragments remain in old testimonies, snatches of syllables resembling the West African Kikongo tongue, mixed with something else. A patternless rhythm that didn't rise or fall, only circled, like a sound folding back into itself. When the plantation's preacher, Reverend Silas Boone, heard it, he ordered her whipped. He called it the devil's lullaby. Yet afterward, he claimed his sleep was invaded by that same melody. His wife awoke one morning to find him standing by the fireplace, humming with his eyes rolled back, ash covering his feet. In church records, Boone wrote one phrase that has puzzled scholars for a century. She sings of the back table, the one the angels refused to sit at. Weeks before the infamous Thanksgiving, Etta's humming spread through the quarters. Children repeated it without knowing why. Utensils clattered when she passed. Milk spoiled when she entered a room. The mistress, Eleanor Ravenscroft, forbade anyone to speak her name during prayer. "Silence her," she told her husband, "or the house will remember." But silence was impossible. The hymn moved through walls like damp air, seeping into wood, echoing in water buckets, even in the ticking of clocks. The overseer said she was cursed. The midwife said she was chosen. And in one surviving note, now sealed in a private archive, a scrawled line trembles across the paper. "If she stops singing, the dead will forget where to go." Thanksgiving Day, 1857, began under a pale orange sky that refused to brighten. A warm fog crawled in from the marshes and clung to the Ravenscroft estate like a fever. The family gathered early: Eleanor, her husband, Judge Malcolm Ravenscroft, their children, and 3 distant relatives from Charleston. The guests complained of the humidity, of the stagnant air, of the uneasy quiet in the house. Only Etta moved easily, gliding from kitchen to table, her hands steady as she poured wine, stirred gravy, and laid out the silver with an elegance that defied her station. She did not speak, but the melody, the hymn, hung faintly on her breath, humming through the clatter of plates and the murmuring of prayer. At noon, when the judge raised his glass to give thanks, something shifted. The candles flared, though no draft had passed. The scent of vinegar and iron thickened. Etta's eyes, witnesses said, reflected the flame twice, as if a second fire burned behind her gaze. She placed the final dish before them, a roast turkey glistening beneath a syrupy glaze no one recognized. "A new recipe," she whispered. "From home." The first bite was greeted with laughter, then silence, then the sound of metal scraping against teeth. One by one their faces paled, hands trembled. The youngest, Clara Ravenscroft, began to hum, a perfect imitation of Etta's tune. Her voice quivered, then cracked. Her mother reached for her, but her arms stiffened mid-air, frozen as wax. Etta stepped back, watching the table as if expecting applause. The judge tried to rise but collapsed forward, his face striking the china. The sound echoed through the hall like the tolling of a bell. Outside, the fog thickened into darkness. Inside, Etta began to sing louder, her voice cutting through the choking gasps, through the rattling of chairs. She sang until no one moved, until the air itself bent toward her, and then silence, except for the faint, rhythmic tapping of a bell. They didn't bury them in the ground. Colleton County's lawmen arrived 3 days after the dinner, drawn by the smell and the rumors that swept through the fields like sickness. The Ravenscroft house stood unnervingly still, its shutters closed, though no one had closed them. The dining room door was locked from within, yet the air leaking through its seams carried the scent of metal and decay. When they forced it open, 8 figures sat exactly as they had been found days earlier, stiff, preserved, eyes fixed on the head of the table where Etta had once stood. Flies avoided them. Their skin, though pale, had not rotted. One officer swore the pupils contracted when he held a lantern close. The Reverend Boone returned to perform the burial rites, but every candle he lit snuffed itself out. The walls seemed to breathe. The witnesses heard faint creaks, tapping rhythmic from within the plaster itself. Unable to bury the dead, they sealed them inside. They chose the east parlor, the coldest room in the house, and built new walls over the corpses, reciting psalms as they worked. Etta's name was never spoken. Her body was never found. Some said she had fled into the swamps. Others whispered she'd been buried with them, bound in silence. But the masons swore something moved inside as they laid the last brick. A low moan. A scrape of silver. One man dropped his trowel and refused to return. Another tore the skin from his fingertips, trying to dig back into the wall before the Reverend dragged him away. That night the bell rang once. Boone left the plantation by dawn, pale and wordless. His final sermon, written the next morning, contains only one verse. When flesh is walled with sin, it does not rest. It listens. The Ravenscroft estate was abandoned by winter, but neighbors said the sound of hammering never stopped. The year was 1877. Reconstruction had come and gone, leaving Colleton County half alive, half ruined. The Ravenscroft estate still stood, choked in vines, its roof caving like a wound that refused to close. Children from nearby farms dared each other to throw stones at its windows, but none crossed the threshold. None except for Sarah Mayfield. She was 9 when she began dreaming of a bell. Her mother said she'd wake in the night, humming a tune too old for her voice, tapping the rhythm against the bedpost. When questioned, Sarah would only whisper, "The lady in the wall sings to me." At first, the neighbors dismissed it as childish fancy. But one morning, Sarah disappeared. Tracks led from her family's small cabin across the fallow fields, straight to the door of the Ravenscroft house. The hinges groaned when her father pushed them open. Inside, dust moved like breath. The air carried a faint scent, vinegar and something coppery beneath. In the east parlor, Sarah sat on the floorboards, her ear pressed to the wall. "She's still in there," the girl said. "She says the dinner isn't done." When her father tried to lift her, she screamed, not in fear but in fury, her voice not her own, layered and resonant. "You sealed the wrong side," it said. Sarah collapsed moments later. Her pulse stopped for 3 full minutes before she gasped back to life. Afterward, she would not speak again. Her father claimed that when he carried her from the house, the wall behind them shifted. A faint pattern like a handprint pressed through the plaster and faded. 2 days later, Reverend Boone's grave, miles away, was found unearthed from within. Sarah lived another year, mute and hollow-eyed. On the night she died, her mother found a scrap of paper under her pillow, written in a child's hand. "She hums through me." She remembers the taste. The letter surfaced in 1911, folded inside a rusted tin box beneath the floorboards of St. Eustace Church. Its ink had turned the color of dried wine, and the signature, Silas Boone, was barely legible. No official record mentions it, but a local archivist named Ruth Danner copied its contents before the original mysteriously vanished from the Charleston archives in 1923. Boone's confession begins simply, "The Lord has turned his face from me. What I sealed was not death but a covenant." He wrote that during the sealing of the Ravenscroft parlor, one body had still been breathing, the youngest child, Clara. Her eyes moved, he said, but she did not blink. When he reached for her, her lips parted, and she whispered something he could not bear to repeat. He described the others as statues, skin cool as marble, yet the faintest pulse visible beneath the throat. Their mouths, slightly open, emitted a slow, rhythmic breath in unison, though none were alive. "We were told to brick them in for mercy's sake," he wrote. But mercy fled that house long before the meal began. Boone admitted that when they laid the final brick, he felt warmth spreading through the mortar, as though the wall itself had swallowed his heartbeat. He saw Etta in the corner, or perhaps what remained of her, her face pale, eyes black and endless, a silver spoon clenched between her teeth. She smiled, he wrote, and said, "Now you serve." Boone fled the next morning, but the hymn followed him. Parishioners claimed to hear humming during his sermons. His hands shook. Communion wine curdled when he touched it. The final line of his confession is almost illegible, smudged as if by tears or blood. The house does not forget. It only waits for another table. The tin box in which it was found bore an engraving no one could explain. A small bell, tied with what looked like strands of hair. When Danner tried to trace the hair, the analysis came back clear. It was human and recent. In 1912, the county approved the demolition of the Ravenscroft estate. The land was to be cleared for a new rail spur, a sign of progress, of forgetting. The house had stood empty for 55 years, its windows blind with dust, its porch strangled by ivy. No one had crossed its threshold since the Mayfield girl's death. The surveyors arrived at dawn. Among them was a man named Edgar Klein, an engineer from Charleston with no patience for superstition. His report, however, preserved in brittle typewritten sheets, suggests something that reason could not contain. He wrote that when they entered the east parlor, the air was warm as a mouth. The plaster on the wall seemed to ripple when light struck it. At first they assumed it was heat distortion, but when one of the men pressed his hand against the surface, the wall yielded, soft as damp clay. A low sound followed, like wind through a bottle or breath through teeth. The men froze. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate, from behind the wall. "Something alive," one whispered. Klein ordered them outside. He returned alone, lantern in hand, determined to prove it was nothing. His notes end abruptly that night. 2 days later, the foreman found the lantern still burning on the floor, but Klein was gone. Only his boot prints remained, leading to the parlor wall, and stopping there. When the workers struck the first hammer blow to begin demolition, the entire house shuddered. The timbers groaned like lungs inhaling. The second strike triggered a sound, an unmistakable metallic chime. The bell, every man fled the site. The demolition was abandoned, and the county sealed the property once again. In the archives, the incident was labeled unexplained structural distortion, but locals knew better. That night, the fog returned from the marsh thick as soup, and the bell rang 9 times. Once for every soul the house had taken. The 9th toll, they say, was softer than the rest. It sounded like a heartbeat. Ruth Danner was meticulous, a woman of order, habit, and caution. She wore gloves when handling paper, burned sage in her study to ward off mildew, and annotated everything in blue pencil. Yet the letter of Reverend Boone defied her sense of control. She transcribed it once, carefully, then found herself compelled to copy it again. And again. Each time the handwriting grew more erratic, less hers, more his. In her personal diary she wrote, "The words change when I look away. They breathe." Co-workers noticed her humming under her breath. At first it sounded like a psalm. By the 3rd week it was something else, low, circular, with no discernible melody. The janitor said he once heard her humming from inside the archive after midnight, though her office lights were off. When he entered, the humming stopped, but her typewriter was clacking by itself, one key striking over and over. She began to lose time. Hours vanished. Days skipped. She awoke in unfamiliar rooms surrounded by scattered pages, her hands stained with dark ink that wasn't from her pen. Doctors called it exhaustion. But she wrote in a shaking hand, "The song writes through me. The house remembers my name." On November 24, 1923, 2 days before Thanksgiving, Danner sent a letter to the Charleston Historical Society, requesting the immediate destruction of all Ravenscroft materials. "Burn it," she wrote. or it will find a way to eat. The next morning she was found dead at her desk, her eyes open, her mouth curled in a faint smile. The coroner noted a strange detail. Both her eardrums had ruptured, as though from a sound too deep to be heard. Her final typed line, half finished, read, "The hymn is not memory, it is invitation." When the clerk filed her papers, he noticed a faint watermark on every sheet, a bell, and beneath it, in almost invisible ink, Etta Ravenscroft. By 1935, the Ravenscroft estate was a ruin, a husk half swallowed by ivy and swamp. Yet the story refused to die. Each Thanksgiving, whispers resurfaced about the bell that rang on its own. The Charleston church elders dismissed it as folklore, until Reverend Thomas Pruitt proposed a symbolic gesture, a Thanksgiving revival, a charity dinner to reclaim the date from darkness. It was meant to feed the poor. Instead, it fed something older. The dinner was held in the church basement directly above where Boone's original sermons had been written. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and iron. Volunteers prepared a long table for 50 guests, candles, pewter plates, and one tarnished silver bell borrowed from the museum archives for historical authenticity. Reverend Pruitt began with prayer, giving thanks for deliverance, for unity, for remembrance. But as he spoke, the candles flickered in perfect rhythm, not to his words, but to a faint humming beneath the floorboards. A woman at the table began tapping her spoon against her cup, an absent-minded tune. Others joined in, unaware they were matching her rhythm. The humming grew louder, the air warmer. Then, without instruction, everyone raised their glasses at once. Pruitt's voice faltered. He saw the same faint smile stretch across every face. When the bell rang, it was not his hand that moved it. The first collapse came from the far end of the table, a boy gasping as if choking on smoke. Then another. Dishes shattered. The sound rose to chaos, and still, beneath it all, the humming continued, weaving through screams like silk through flesh. When police arrived, they found 32 people unconscious, their eyes open, their hands clasped in prayer. The remaining 18 were missing, chairs overturned, cutlery scattered. The silver bell lay on the floor, tied with what appeared to be hair. For weeks afterward, the basement lights flickered every night at 11:48, the time of the first collapse. When the church was finally closed, parishioners reported one final message carved into the altar's underside: "The table is set again." In 1941, a historian from Columbia University named Dr. Henry Alcott began compiling what he called the Ravenscroft Register, a genealogical study tracing the plantation's surviving relatives. His project began as an academic curiosity. It ended in obsession. Alcott's notes, later recovered from his boarding room after his disappearance, reveal an uncanny pattern. Every major incident linked to the estate, the poisoning, the Mayfield child, the disappearance of Edgar Klein, the church dinner, had involved at least one person carrying the same bloodline. The name appeared in altered forms through census records: Ravenscroft, Ravencroft, Rainscroft, Rain. The line stretched from 1857 to the present, each generation thinner, quieter, scattered across the Carolinas. Alcott identified 9 names in total. The 9th belonged to a woman living in Beaufort County in 1941, Etta Rain. She was a domestic worker, 34 years old, with no known children. When Alcott wrote to request an interview, she refused until she learned what name he was tracing. Her reply came in a single sentence, handwritten in black ink: "I have been waiting for someone to remember." Alcott met her at dusk on November 23rd. Neighbors later said they saw the two enter her small white house at the edge of the marsh. Only one was seen leaving. Inside, police found 9 empty plates set neatly on the table, each with a folded scrap of paper bearing a different name, his included. On the wall above the plates, a faint pattern had been drawn in soot. a circle enclosing a single bell. Alcott's notes end mid-sentence. She told me the hymn was never meant to summon the dead. It was meant to feed the living, to keep them from rotting. She said, "The next page is blank except for fingerprints in something dark and flaked." Etta Rain vanished that night. Her house burned to the ground before dawn. Witnesses said they heard singing in the flames. Low, measured, and impossibly calm. In 1952, a small documentary crew from Savannah College arrived in Colleton County to produce a short film titled Echoes of the South, Forgotten Houses and Folklore. They'd heard rumors of the Ravenscroft estate, its cursed dinner, the poisoned family, the bell that rang each Thanksgiving, and thought it perfect for a student thesis on haunted Americana. The director, Louis Farrow, was only 26. His assistant handled the camera, a handheld 16mm Bell and Howell. They set up at dawn, dust swirling through the parlor's light. The air hung thick and humid, tasting faintly of rust. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The footage, later recovered in fragments, shows Farrow laughing nervously as he reads from Boone's confession. "The house remembers," he says, smiling into the lens. Then, faintly in the background, the bell rings, once, twice, a third time. Farrow turns, startled. The bell, hanging from a cracked beam, moves on its own, slowly, precisely, without wind. The camera trembles. A faint humming bleeds into the audio track, low, pulsing, like breath against glass. Then comes the whisper. No one on set reported hearing it at the time. But when the film was developed, a woman's voice is faintly audible beneath the hum. The words are difficult to decipher except for 3 syllables: soft, deliberate, and cold, still hungry. Moments later, the footage ends abruptly. The camera falls sideways, showing a single frame before it cuts to static, the east parlor wall, rippling. When police entered 2 days later, they found the camera but no sign of Farrow or his crew. Only the film remained, developed but unspooled, its end fused by heat as if burned from within. Experts reviewing the footage decades later reported a final, single frame visible when slowed to 1/24 of a second. It shows a dining table set for 9. Each chair is occupied, and the one at the head of the table is empty. Thanksgiving night, 1963. Across the country, families gathered around their televisions. Turkey carved, pie cooling, laughter dimmed by the static hum of news anchors mourning a president lost only days earlier. The American mood was raw, quiet, uncertain. At exactly 8:17 p.m., a local Charleston station, WCRX, aired a short documentary filler between programs, Echoes of the South, credited to Louis Farrow and his missing film crew. It was a test broadcast meant to fill 3 minutes of dead air. It lasted 12. According to archived station logs, the reel began as expected. Grainy shots of the Colleton marshes. A narrator's smooth baritone describing the forgotten plantations of the Low Country. But halfway through, the narration warped. The image shuddered, and then the bell rang. Viewers reported their screens flickering from sepia to stark monochrome. The film showed the Ravenscroft dining room, table set, candles lit, walls breathing faintly in and out. Then a woman's voice whispered beneath the static, "Give thanks, or be taken." The audio cut out. For exactly 32 seconds, the image froze on a single frame. 9 figures seated around the table, heads bowed in prayer. One of them lifted her eyes and looked directly into the camera. Her face, viewers said, resembled a composite of many. White, black, male, female, shifting with each flicker. When the feed resumed, a blank gray screen filled the airwaves. The station's emergency line lit up with hundreds of calls. Families claiming their televisions had begun humming, their dining room silver vibrating, their children repeating an unfamiliar tune. CRX shut down the reel and replaced it with a test pattern. The FCC ordered the segment destroyed the following morning. All known copies were seized. Yet one frame survived. A photograph of a television set captured accidentally by a viewer's Polaroid camera. In the reflection of the screen, a faint outline stands behind the photographer, small, dark-eyed and smiling. The photo was later labeled Etta, if true. In 1974, Dr. Malcolm Hensley, a former historian from Chapel Hill, began what he called a project of preservation. He had spent years studying plantation archives and slave records, convinced that folklore held truths the written word could not bear to admit. The Ravenscroft account, rumors of a poisoned Thanksgiving, an unfilmed confession, a haunted reel, fascinated him. But what drew him most was the recurring mention of bells. Every retelling, every testimony spoke of a bell that rang without wind. He began collecting them. Over 9 years, Hensley acquired 63 plantation bells from Charleston to St. Augustine, brass, iron, silver, tin. He cataloged each carefully in his ledger, marking the date, location, and tone frequency. Some rang bright as laughter, others deep like a buried heart. He wrote to colleagues that the bells possess harmonic signatures of human speech, claiming certain tones resembled the vowel sounds of names: Etta, Boone, Ravenscroft. His obsession became isolation. Neighbors reported hearing him at all hours, testing pitches, transcribing what he called phonetic resonances. He believed one of the bells, small, rusted, engraved with a faint R, belonged to the original Ravenscroft estate. On November 24, 1983, Thanksgiving Eve, Hensley recorded his final entry. His handwriting trembled, his words broken across the page. I found it. The true bell. It does not echo, it answers. I rang it twice. The third must never sound. The next morning his house was found empty. The dining table was set for 9. Police reports note that every bell in the collection, 62 of them, had shattered simultaneously. Only one remained whole, the smallest, engraved R. When officers lifted it, it rang once softly, though no one had touched it. The vibration was said to last exactly 48 seconds, and when it stopped, a faint whisper was captured on the audio log attached to the investigation file. Still hungry? In the winter of 1992, the South Carolina Historical Society received a sealed crate from a private collector's estate in Raleigh. The manifest listed it as Hensley Collection, Plantation Artifacts. Among the contents, fractured bells, ledger fragments, and an envelope labeled simply Ravenscroft. The crate was placed in the restricted archives, awaiting cataloging. For months it sat untouched in a climate-controlled vault, behind locked iron doors. On the night of February 19th, the building's fire alarms erupted at 2:14 a.m. Witnesses described the smoke as sweet, like burning honey and metal. The blaze consumed 3 entire rooms of historical records, church registers, plantation inventories, and personal correspondence from the 1800s. But investigators discovered something strange. The fire had burned from the inside out. The walls were scorched behind glass cases that never cracked. Paper was turned to ash without melting the binders that held it. When the ashes were sifted, archivists found a single item intact amid the ruin: a child's drawing on thick parchment, its edges browned but unburned. It depicted a long dining table set for 9. Around it sat faceless figures drawn in charcoal, each with one hand extended as though waiting for something to be placed there. At the head of the table stood a small girl, her dress shaded black. Above her head was a bell drawn in gold ink, perfectly round, gleaming faintly even under soot. On the back of the parchment, written in old cursive ink, was a single sentence: They fed on what fed them. When the archivist who discovered it, Margaret Keene, attempted to file the piece under plantation lore, miscellaneous, her computer crashed repeatedly. The system logs show that each attempt auto-corrected the file name to Etta. 3 days later, Keene resigned and moved to Montana. She refused all interviews. The drawing has never been found since. In the winter of 1992, The South Carolina Historical Society received a sealed crate from a private collector's estate in Raleigh. The manifest listed it as Hensley Collection, Plantation Artifacts. Among the contents, fractured bells, ledger fragments, and an envelope labeled simply Ravenscroft. The crate was placed in the restricted archives, awaiting cataloging. For months it sat untouched in a climate-controlled vault, behind locked iron doors. On the night of February 19th, the building's fire alarms erupted at 2:14 a.m. Witnesses described the smoke as sweet, like burning honey and metal. The blaze consumed 3 entire rooms of historical records, church registers, plantation inventories, and personal correspondence from the 1800s. But investigators discovered something strange. The fire had burned from the inside out. The walls were scorched behind glass cases that never cracked. Paper was turned to ash without melting the binders that held it. When the ashes were sifted, archivists found a single item intact amid the ruin: a child's drawing on thick parchment, its edges browned but unburned. It depicted a long dining table set for 9. Around it sat faceless figures drawn in charcoal, each with one hand extended as though waiting for something to be placed there. At the head of the table stood a small girl, her dress shaded black. Above her head was a bell drawn in gold ink, perfectly round, gleaming faintly even under soot. On the back of the parchment, written in old cursive ink, was a single sentence: "They fed on what fed them." When the archivist who discovered it, Margaret Keene, attempted to file the piece under Plantation lore, miscellaneous, her computer crashed repeatedly. The system logs show that each attempt auto-corrected the file name to Etta. 3 days later, Keene resigned and moved to Montana. She refused all interviews. The drawing has never been found since. In November 2001, the small St. Bartholomew parish in Colleton County began a tradition of recording its Thanksgiving Eve services for elderly members who could no longer attend. The tapes were meant to preserve comfort, not history, yet what they captured was neither. The church itself stood on repurposed land once belonging to the Ravenscroft estate, though few parishioners knew it. Beneath the new white paint and crucifix beams lay the old cellar foundation, bricked over and sealed decades ago. The first tape plays normally for 13 minutes. Then during the prayer of gratitude, the priest's microphone begins to hum, a deep, metallic vibration that distorts the choir's voices into droning dissonance. At 13:47, the hum resolves into a rhythm, 3 low tones, a pause, then 3 again, a bell. The priest stops mid-sentence. A murmur spreads through the congregation. On the recording, a woman's whisper can be heard faintly behind the sound. "Give thanks, or be taken." After several seconds, the hum ceases. The priest continues shakily, visibly pale. No one recalls the whisper in person. Yet every playback of the tape reproduces it. Same tone, same timing. By 2003, 3 more recordings showed similar distortions. Each occurred precisely 48 minutes into the service. Each featured the same whispered phrase, but 1 year a name was added: Etta. Engineers sent to inspect the sound system found nothing wrong. No feedback, no electrical interference, no outside transmission source. One technician quit mid-analysis, claiming the static had begun mimicking his breathing. After the 5th tape, the parish stopped recording. The archives were sealed under diocesan authority. But in 2007, an anonymous clip surfaced online, a digital transfer of the first tape. The sound quality is degraded, the voices warped by static. Yet in the background, under the final bell, something new can be heard. A faint scrape, the chair sliding back, and then a child's voice, soft and polite, saying, "May I be excused?" In 2016, a small independent podcast titled American Morning dedicated an episode to the Ravenscroft poisonings. The host, Gideon Ward, was a former theology student turned folklorist who prided himself on uncovering the dark seams of faith beneath history. He'd received a flash drive from an anonymous sender. Inside were cleaned-up digital versions of the St. Bartholomew tapes, and what appeared to be fragments from the long-lost echoes of the South film. The episode aired on Thanksgiving morning under the title, The Feast That Ate Itself. Listeners described it as hypnotic. Gideon's calm baritone recounted the Ravenscroft tragedy in chilling detail, threading together historical facts, plantation diaries, and sound samples of the bells. Midway through, he played one of the recordings, 3 tones. A pause, then 3 again. Within minutes, the comment feed exploded. Dozens of listeners reported their speakers humming, their rooms vibrating. Some claimed to smell copper or hear faint dishes clinking from nowhere. At 28:13, Gideon's voice faltered. Static flooded the stream. For 11 seconds, the podcast transmitted only low frequencies, barely audible but enough to disrupt nearby devices. Listeners' phones rebooted themselves. A few reported their smart assistants whispering phrases unsummoned. The episode cut abruptly with a final whisper. Give thanks, or be taken. When the audio returned, Gideon's voice was gone. Instead, the feed broadcast what sounded like a child reciting a dinner prayer, then soft laughter. Authorities found Ward's apartment 2 days later. The microphone was still live, recording. The table in his small studio was set for 9. His laptop screen glowed with the podcast dashboard. Under upcoming episodes, a draft had been auto-scheduled, dated exactly 1 year ahead. Its title, Part 2, The House That Listens. No one had access to his publishing account after his death, yet on Thanksgiving morning the following year, the episode uploaded itself, and this time, the bell didn't ring 3 times. It rang 9. In 2019, a group of historians and folklorists from Emory University launched a research project titled Reclaiming the Table, Food, Ritual, and Power in Antebellum America. It was meant to be a controlled reenactment of the 1857 Ravenscroft Thanksgiving dinner, recreated using verified ingredients, original recipes, and documented dining customs. Their leader, Dr. Helena Marchand, dismissed warnings about the curse as superstition. History must be tasted to be understood, she told the Charleston Gazette. The dinner took place on November 28th in a rented plantation house less than 5 miles from the original Ravenscroft site. The team set 9 chairs, 8 researchers, 1 reserved for symbolism, to represent the unseen witness, as Marchand phrased it. The menu was exact. Wild duck, sweet potatoes, spiced pear pudding, and wine brewed from aged scuppernongs. Every detail was authentic. Even the bell used to call for grace, purchased from a private collection once owned by Dr. Malcolm Hensley. Footage from the event begins formally, with laughter and discussion. But at the 47-minute mark, the audio warps. The bell rings, once, twice, thrice, and the laughter stops. One of the cameras captures condensation forming on the window, though the night outside is warm. The glass fogs, then clears to reveal faint handprints, 9 of them, each pressed from the outside. Dr. Marchand continues narrating for the documentary crew, her tone nervous but steady, until her microphone records a faint whisper directly behind her. They fed on what fed them. She glances toward the empty chair. The seat cushion depresses slightly as if something unseen has settled there. Then a sharp noise like a fork snapping. The camera cuts out. The next morning, neighbors reported smoke and the smell of scorched fruit. Authorities found the dining room intact, untouched by fire, but all 8 researchers were gone. Only the bell remained on the table, still vibrating faintly. The video footage, when recovered, ended with a single still frame, the empty chair. Someone had placed a plate before it, filled with blood-dark wine. By early 2021, the disappearance of Dr. Marchand and her team had drawn national attention. Federal investigators labeled it an environmental incident, though no evidence of fire, flood, or structural collapse was found. The only anomaly noted was a sustained Low-frequency hum detected within a half-mile radius of the eye. Property. Recorded precisely at midnight on Thanksgiving Day. The audio lasted 48 seconds. The same duration noted in Boone's confession. The same length as Hensley's final. Bell agents discovered something else. The waveform of the hum, when converted into spectrogram imagery, formed an outline unmistakably resembling a table, 9 chairs around a central void. That year, emergency rooms across South Carolina reported a sudden spike in patients complaining of phantom ringing in their ears. Nearly all incidents occurred during family meals, prayers, or televised Thanksgiving specials. Witnesses described feeling watched while eating, as if waiting for permission to begin. The CDC dismissed it as mass psychosomatic resonance, a stress response amplified by social media hysteria. But internal memos leaked months later revealed something darker. The frequencies captured on site matched those from archived church recordings and Pharaoh's original film reel, separated by more than a century, identical down to the final oscillation. In December, the Department of Homeland Security quietly designated Ravenscroft a containment zone. The surrounding area was purchased under an energy research grant. Locals reported new fencing, unmarked vehicles, and a sign reading, Department of Acoustic Studies, authorized personnel only. Residents noticed something else, too. Every year since 2021 at exactly 8:17 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, televisions in Colleton County emit a faint, rhythmic distortion, 3 tones, then silence. The same sequence repeats fainter each time until it disappears completely, and when it stops, there's a moment of stillness too deep for silence, too long for breath. That's when the dogs start howling. The investigation into the Ravenscroft phenomenon ended, or was declared ended, in 2023. The official report, never released to the public, was leaked 6 months later by a whistleblower from the Department of Acoustic Studies. It contained only 22 pages. The final page was a transcript of an internal recording labeled Session 9. It begins with static, then the faint clinking of dishes. A woman's voice, calm, polite, educated, asks the unseen audience to join hands and bow heads. Another voice, male, answers quietly, "Are you one of them?" "No," she says. "I was what they made." The audio peaks, the hum returning in perfect triple intervals. Instruments register temperature drops of 20 degrees. Shadows move though the lights stay still. Then the voice speaks again, softer now. They gave thanks for what they took. They prayed over their hunger and called it grace. "You killed them," the man whispers. "No," she says. "I fed them." "On what?" "On themselves." The recording ends with a single bell strike, low, endless, vibrating beyond human frequency. Analysts noted that when slowed by a factor of 9, the tone concealed a layered message. Phonetic mapping revealed it wasn't a word but a name. Etta Ravenscroft. She was never a house slave. Parish records uncovered later showed no such name among the enslaved at Ravenscroft. Instead, the plantation's final ledger lists her as Etta Ravenscroft, born 1844, died 1857, age 13, a child. The family's youngest daughter. Poison traces were found decades later in her preserved hair sample from a locket recovered during excavation. She hadn't served the poison. She'd swallowed it. The family died after drinking from her cup. Each year since, the bell has rung not to haunt, but to warn, to remind us what gratitude costs when built on hunger. The chair was never empty. It was waiting. And every time we give thanks, somewhere, quietly, politely, Etta rises to make sure the table is full.